Our fourth presenter is Augustine Beard. The title of his presentation is The Enemy in the Forests, the Public Perception of Forest Fires in the Pacific Northwest, 1933 to 1965.
Hi there. I'm Augustine, and my project is titled Enemy in the Forests. What I'm looking at is the public perception of forest fires in the Pacific Northwest from the period of 1933 through 1965, with an emphasis on World War II. Before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible, for all of the undergraduate researchers, Carl and everyone else. This is a really great opportunity, and I hope it continues for a long time into the future. So most of you probably recognize this imagery here, especially the one on the left there, Smokey Bear. But these other two, Keep Oregon Green and Keep Washington Green, those were more prolific from the 1940s through the 1970s or so, but these organizations still exist today. These are like obviously state-level organizations, but with similar messages for forest fire prevention. What my research does is I look at the environmental narratives that these organizations produce in the economic and political context of fire ecology and management in the Pacific Northwest. I realize that sounds really vague. Before I get to my specific argument, I'm going to have to give a little background history of forest fires in the Northwest. So the history of fire in America, and particularly the Northwest, is a history of the U.S. Forest Service and is a history of the timber industry, along with the aggressive fire suppression policy that has lasted for the past century. So what I have pictured here is the aftermath of the 1911 Big Burn, and Mr. William Greeley, who was the chief of the U.S. Forest Service between 1920 and 1928. So this was a really big fire that swept across the West and really burnt a hole into the wilderness conservationists like Greeley and John Muir. Greeley, after this fire, said that smoke in the woods was his metric for the success of American forestry. What he was talking about there was the fire suppression policy, which insisted on the immediate suppression of fires as soon as possible, regardless of the cost to the state. And this policy really reached its apotheosis in the early 1930s with a series of fires in the Pacific Northwest with the 10 a.m. policy. The 10 a.m. policy stated that foresters and firefighters needed a plan to put out fires by 10 a.m. the day after they started. So in retrospect, we see now that this policy caused a lot of damage. It allowed for the buildup of highly flammable fuels in forests across America, and that has led, along with drier seasons and rising temperatures, has led to more frequent and larger fires. It disrupted the ecological role that fires play for plant and animal life in the Northwest. So we see now it's problematic. However, the suppression policy still persists, not as strongly as it used to, but it received more challenge beginning in the 1980s, but it still persists. There's three sort of explanations for why it's persisted in the historiography. The first is that the U.S. Forest Service was naive and didn't know what it was doing. This explanation is insufficient. The Forest Service had a lot of science that contradicted the fire suppression policy. However, it maintained a stubborn persistence on keeping this policy. The other two explanations are more sufficient, I find. The first is that the Forest Service needed to justify its existence and extraordinary autonomy from the federal government, as well as a big budget. It had this problem that kept reoccurring each year, and it had the right to suppress fires on both private and public land, so no one questions its existence and its budget. I shouldn't say no one. It didn't receive as much criticism as it should have. The next explanation is that the timber industry actually had a lot of control over this policy, that the regulatees, the timber industry, really became the regulators and used fire suppression policy to protect timber capital and their economic interests. So what I look at is, well, the historiography is really focused on the state and the economics of fire. What my research does is look at the environmental narrative that made this all possible in the public sphere. So the public interface of this. This is important because in a democracy, it matters what the public thinks of the federal government and state policy. So my research focuses mostly on the Keep Oregon Green and a little bit the Keep Washington Green Association, while drawing on a lot of resources from the federal government, because in the Northwest, people would have seen both Keep Oregon Green as well as Keep Washington Green and federal propaganda like Smokey the Bear. So I argue that these organizations created the fire enemy narrative, which insisted on the unquestioning vilification of all fires, regardless of their cause and their cost. So this narrative began in World War II with, at the beginning of World War II, when Keep Oregon Green started. What I'm going to do is explain how this narrative emerged during World War II and sort of the aspects of this narrative. Then I'm going to explain the institution of Keep Oregon Green and why institutionally it supported the interests of timber capital. Then I'm going to return to a discussion of the narrative after World War II and sort of trace it to the narrative we have around fires in the media today. So you can see here, forest fire was really associated with national defense. This rhetoric right here kind of sums it up. Forest defense is national defense. They saw forest fires as inherently destructive to the war effort. This one, careless matches, weapons of sabotage. So fire wasn't an ecological phenomenon. It was a weapon of war. Keep Oregon Green had played a big role in this in the Northwest. Every forest fire is an axis fire. Every forest fire is an axis fire, regardless of the reason. Then right here, delayed action bomb, referring to the cigarette butt right there. So Keep Oregon Green really influenced this rhetoric a lot as well. The extreme aspects of this rhetoric really emerged in around 1942 and 1943, when the war on fire became a racial war. So you see here the awful caricature of the Japanese man. This ad appeared in the Hefner Gazette-Times in Oregon newspaper. This one is probably the most famous poster of its kind. This one appeared across the U.S. So not only were fires a weapon and destructive to the war effort, they were a foreign threat as well. So in addition to this, there were ties. Obviously, there's implicit ties to the timber industry. If all forest fires are evil, then we should suppress all forest fires. This supported the interest of the timber industry. But then more explicitly, Keep Oregon Green reports and media reports would give the damage of forest fires in acreage and cost, the cost being the cost to suppress the fires and the opportunity cost to the timber industry, always reported in the annual reports of Keep Oregon Green as well as media reports of the time. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the institution of Keep Oregon Green. So the bylaws stated that the balance of representatives should be forestry representatives, agricultural interests, and the public interests. However, of usually about 20 Board of Trustees members, usually about 15 represented timber interests, with never really more than 2 agricultural and ranching interests represented on the Keep Oregon Green Board of Trustees, and the rest were politicians. The main financial support for Keep Oregon Green came from logging operations, the lumber industry, lumber wholesales, and timber owners. Not much donations coming from agricultural interests. And additionally, Keep Oregon Green, where that money went was mostly to staffing and office supply costs. Keep Oregon Green received free radio slots, free TV slots, press releases, among other things, mostly by donations. You can see that the iconography was really mutually owned. So right here is a state sign on a public road, and here Keep Oregon Green appears on a private billboard for the timber industries, for insurance company. So thus the narrative and the institution of Keep Oregon Green supported the timber interests. So then after the war, the fire enemy narrative really continued. You see Oregon's Pearl Harbor referring to a cycle in the Tillamook burn, potential forest holocaust cited at 2 state forestry conference, really sensationalist rhetoric there. That was in 1963. And in addition, the media reported always crews fly to battle, a lot of warlike rhetoric. So then what I'm going to do now is discuss the sort of fire narrative today. The fire narrative here kind of fizzled with the Vietnam War. People began questioning actual wars, and as well at this time people began questioning the fire suppression policy. So you'll still see the sort of warlike call to arms rhetoric today, but it's not as prolific as it was from the 1940s through the 1960s. The narrative today has a similar tone of refracting public fears onto our understanding of fires with headlines like this. This is New York Times. Dry days bring ferocious start to fire season. Officials are warning about the potential for more catastrophe in the months ahead as drought, heat, and climate change leave the landscape even thirstier. So they really focus on climate change and global warming as the reason for larger fires. Here's what I suggest as a headline. A century of wildfire mismanagement and the pervasive narrative insisting on the vilification, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but jokes aside, what I leave out here is actually, what I should have done is included an explanation as well of the ecological phenomena on fire. Fire in this narrative are solely ecological, but we need to understand fire as a political ecological phenomenon if we're going to have a healthy democracy and state that can manage fire. So as I transition into my question and answer period, I would just like to say that only you can prevent harmful environmental narratives.
Thank you. Questions for Augustine?
Have any practices changed since the change in rhetoric?
Yeah, a little bit. So prescribed fires, which has always really been the challenging political ideas since the Big Burn, has been practiced more. So that's the practice of actually lighting fires in advance to get rid of some of the fuels before larger fires begin. And that's practiced more, but fire suppression is still problematic. Oh, something I forgot to mention was that the global warming sort of narrative, recently the Obama administration introduced a proposition to classify wildfires as I can't remember the wording, natural disasters, I think, which would give the U.S. Forest Service the ability, in the case of wildfires, to exceed its allocated budget to fight the wildfires with as much money as they want. So the fire suppression policy still persists, even though it might not be the best policy.
What's the role of the timber industry now in this process?
I wish I could tell you. That would be a good place for future research. Really, most of my sources and most of my research stopped at in the 1960s. I think that would be a good place to look in the future.
Did you look at any local cities here, like Bend or Eugene or Springfield, that was really big on environmental issues?
Yeah, a little bit. So I found some newspapers that were local newspapers. They appeared on some digital archives. So that's where a lot of my media evidence came from. I didn't discuss that as much here. The Keep Oregon Green stuff was a little more interesting to me, so that's what I presented here. But I don't have a particular explanation of town to town, what it was like specifically in Eugene. I didn't try to focus it based on localities.
Other questions for Augustine? Join me in thanking him.
Thank you.